Tonight, we're diving into one of the most dramatic wedding stories in the entire Bible. Picture this: you work 7 years for the woman you love. 7 long years of hard labor under the burning sun. Finally, your wedding day arrives. You celebrate all night. But when morning comes, you discover you married the wrong woman. This is the true story of Jacob and Laban from Genesis chapter 29. A story about love and deception and the consequences of our past catching up with us. Get comfortable and let's journey back to ancient Mesopotamia, where one of the greatest cons in biblical history is about to unfold. So let's set the stage here. Jacob wasn't exactly an innocent guy when our story begins. You see, Jacob had just pulled off one of the biggest scams in his family's history. He tricked his own father, Isaac, who was old and nearly blind. Jacob pretended to be his older brother Esau and stole the blessing that rightfully belonged to Esau. Now you might be thinking, what's the big deal about a blessing? But in that culture, a father's blessing was everything. It determined who would lead the family, who would inherit the wealth, who would carry on the family name and legacy. And Jacob straight up stole it. He wore goat skins on his arms to feel hairy like his brother. He wore Esau's clothes to smell like him. He lied right to his father's face. And when Esau found out, oh man, Esau was furious. We're talking murderous rage kind of furious. Esau literally planned to kill Jacob as soon as their father died. So Jacob's mother Rebekah came up with a plan. She told Jacob to run. Run far away to her brother Laban's house in Haran. Stay there until Esau's anger cooled down. Maybe a few weeks, she thought. Maybe a few months at most. But here's the thing about running from your problems. Sometimes you run straight into something worse. So Jacob left everything behind. His home, his family, his comfortable life. And he started walking. Day after day, under the scorching Middle Eastern sun. His feet blistered and bleeding. His water running low. But he kept going because what choice did he have? And during those long, lonely days on the road, Jacob had plenty of time to think, to replay what he'd done, to wonder if maybe he'd gone too far this time. You know that feeling when you've done something you can't take back. When you lie awake at night, replaying it over and over in your mind. That was Jacob, the deceiver, the trickster, the guy who thought he was so clever, now running for his life with nothing but the clothes on his back. After weeks of travel, Jacob finally reached the land of his mother's people. He was exhausted, dirty, and probably wondering what he'd gotten himself into. Then he came to this well. Now wells were super important back then. They were like the ancient version of a town square, a place where people gathered, where news was exchanged, where life happened. And Jacob sat down by this well to rest. He saw some shepherds there with their flocks waiting to water their sheep. And Jacob, being Jacob, started asking questions. Where are you guys from? Do you know a man named Laban? And that's when it happened. The shepherds pointed and said, oh yeah, we know Laban. In fact, here comes his daughter Rachel right now with his sheep. And Jacob looked up, and there she was, Rachel, walking toward the well with her father's flock. And something happened in Jacob's heart that he'd never felt before. This wasn't just attraction. This was different. The Bible says Rachel was beautiful in form and appearance. But it was more than that. Maybe it was the way she carried herself. The way she handled the sheep with such care and confidence. The way the sunlight caught her face. Whatever it was, Jacob was completely smitten. Now here's where it gets interesting. There was this huge stone covering the well. Usually it took multiple shepherds to roll it away. But Jacob was so pumped up on adrenaline and love hormones that he ran over and rolled that massive stone away all by himself. Can you imagine? This guy who'd been traveling for weeks, exhausted and depleted, suddenly has superhuman strength because he sees this woman. He watered her sheep. And then, and this is amazing, he kissed her right there in front of everyone and started crying, just weeping with emotion. Now, before you think that's weird, you gotta understand the context. Jacob had been on the run, alone, afraid, unsure of his future. And suddenly, here was Rachel. Family, safety, hope. A future he didn't think he'd have. All wrapped up in one person. Rachel ran home and told her father Laban that Jacob had arrived. And when Laban heard the news, he ran out to meet him, hugged him, kissed him, brought him home. For the first time in weeks, Jacob felt safe. He stayed with Laban and worked for him, helping with the flocks. And every single day, he saw Rachel. Every single day, he fell more in love. After Jacob had been there about a month, Laban came to him. Now Laban, he was a businessman, a shrewd operator, and he said to Jacob, "Just because you're my relative doesn't mean you should work for me for nothing. Tell me, what should your wages be?" And this is where Jacob made his move. He'd been thinking about this, planning it, rehearsing it in his mind. He said, "I'll work for you 7 years, for Rachel, your younger daughter." 7 years. Let that sink in for a moment. In today's terms, that's like saying, "I'll work for you full-time with no salary for 7 years. 84 months. About 2,500 days. All for the chance to marry the woman he loved." Now Laban had 2 daughters, Leah the older one and Rachel the younger one. The Bible says Leah had weak eyes. Scholars debate what that means exactly. Maybe she had poor eyesight. Maybe her eyes lacked sparkle. Whatever it was, the Bible makes it clear that Rachel was the more attractive sister. And everyone knew it, including Leah. Can you imagine what that must have felt like for Leah? To constantly be compared to her younger sister. To know that when men saw them together, they always chose Rachel. To feel invisible, unwanted, second choice. But Jacob only had eyes for Rachel. And Laban, well, Laban saw an opportunity here. He could see how much Jacob loved Rachel. He could see that Jacob was desperate. On the run from his brother, no other options. Nowhere else to go. So Laban said, "Better that I give her to you than to another man. Stay with me." And just like that, the deal was made. 7 years of free labor for one woman. Now you might be thinking Laban was pretty shrewd here. But remember who he was dealing with. Jacob the deceiver. Jacob the con artist. Jacob who'd just scammed his own brother and father. Laban knew exactly who Jacob was. And maybe he was already planning something. So Jacob started working. And here's what's amazing. The Bible says that 7 years seemed like only a few days to him because of his love for Rachel. 7 years seemed like a few days. Let that blow your mind for a second. When you're in love with someone, when you have hope for the future, when you have something to work toward, time moves differently. Jacob woke up every morning before dawn. He led the sheep to pasture. He protected them from predators. He dealt with the scorching heat of summer and the cold of winter. He sheared sheep. He helped with lambing season. He did all the dirty, difficult work of a shepherd. And yeah, there were hard days. Days when his back ached and his hands were raw. Days when the sheep scattered and he had to search for hours to find them. Days when he was so tired he could barely stand. But then he'd see Rachel. Maybe she'd bring him water while he worked. Maybe they'd talk in the evening after the work was done. Maybe they'd plan their future together. What their home would be like. How many children they'd have. What they'd name them. And suddenly, the work didn't seem so bad. The years didn't seem so long. Because he had something worth working for. And you know what? During those 7 years, Jacob changed. The young man who'd fled from home. The deceiver who'd stolen his brother's blessing. He was growing up, learning patience, learning what it meant to work hard for something, learning that love sometimes requires sacrifice. He was becoming a better man than he'd been when he arrived, or at least he thought he was. But here's the thing about character. Real character isn't tested when everything's going your way. It's tested when things go wrong. And Jacob was about to face the biggest test of his life. Finally, the day came. 7 years of waiting. 7 years of working. 7 years of dreaming. It was time. Jacob went to Laban and said, "Give me my wife. My time is completed. I want to sleep with her." Now that might sound crude, but remember, this is a translation of ancient Hebrew. What Jacob was really saying was, "I've fulfilled my obligation. I've kept my end of the bargain. It's time for you to keep yours." And Laban agreed. He threw a huge wedding feast. This wasn't just any party. This was the event of the season. Everyone in the area was invited. There was food and wine, music and dancing, celebration that went on and on. The whole community came together to celebrate. Now here's what you need to understand about wedding customs back then. The bride would be heavily veiled, completely covered from head to toe. You couldn't see her face, couldn't see anything really, and the celebration would go on all day and into the night, with lots and lots of wine, everyone drinking and celebrating, including the groom. Jacob was probably the happiest he'd ever been in his life. After 7 long years, he was finally marrying the woman he loved, the woman he'd worked so hard for, the woman he'd dreamed about every single night. He drank the wine. He celebrated with the guests. He was floating on air. And when evening came, when the celebration reached its peak, they brought the bride to Jacob, still veiled, still covered, and following the custom of the time, Jacob took his bride into the tent, into the darkness, and they consummated the marriage. Jacob finally had his Rachel, or so he thought. Morning came. The sun rose over the desert. Light began to filter into the tent, and Jacob woke up. Maybe he smiled. Maybe he reached over to touch his new wife. Maybe he wanted to finally see Rachel's face in the daylight. And then he looked, and his heart stopped. This wasn't Rachel. This was Leah. Jacob's mind must have been racing. How is this possible? When did this happen? Did I dream the whole thing? Did I drink too much? What is going on? But no, this was real. Leah was lying there beside him. And suddenly, everything crashed down on him. The realization of what had happened. He'd been tricked, deceived, conned by his father-in-law. Can you imagine the emotions flooding through Jacob in that moment? Shock, disbelief, anger, betrayal, rage, and maybe somewhere deep down, a horrible realization. This is what it felt like. This is what he'd done to his brother Esau. This is what it feels like to be on the receiving end of deception. But there was no time to process those feelings, because Jacob jumped up and stormed out of the tent. He marched straight to Laban's tent, and he was furious. "What is this you have done to me? I served you for Rachel, didn't I? Why have you deceived me?" Jacob used that word, deceived, the very thing he'd done to his own family, now done to him. And Laban was cool as a cucumber. He looked at Jacob and said, "It's not our custom here to give the younger daughter in marriage before the older one." Like this was just common knowledge. Like everyone knew this. Like Jacob should have known this. But here's the thing. Laban never mentioned this rule 7 years ago. Never brought it up when they made their deal. He let Jacob work for 7 years, thinking he was working for Rachel. He let Jacob believe he was going to marry Rachel. He planned this deception from the very beginning. And now he had the audacity to act like this was just how things were done. Like Jacob was the one being unreasonable. But Laban wasn't done. He said, "Finish out this daughter's bridal week. Then we'll give you the younger one. Also, in return for another 7 years of work." Another 7 years. Jacob had already given 7 years. 7 years of his life. 7 years of hard labor. And now Laban wanted 7 more. But what choice did Jacob have? He'd already consummated the marriage with Leah. In that culture, that marriage was binding. There was no going back. And he still loved Rachel, still wanted to marry her. So Jacob agreed. But this time, the deal was different. This time, he would get Rachel after just 1 more week. He'd marry Rachel too. But then he'd owe Laban 7 more years of work. So 1 week later, Jacob married Rachel, the woman he'd loved all along. The woman he'd worked 7 years for. Finally, she was his wife. The Bible tells us that Jacob loved Rachel more than Leah. Everyone knew it, especially Leah. Can you imagine being Leah in this situation? You didn't ask for this. You were pawned off on a man who didn't want you, a man who wanted your sister. Every time Jacob looked at you, he was wishing you were Rachel. Every time he spoke to you, there was disappointment in his voice. Every time he touched you, he was thinking of her. And you knew it. You felt it every single day. And Rachel, she got what she wanted, the man she loved. But at what cost? Now she had to share him with her sister, her own sister, the sister she'd grown up with, the sister who was now her rival. And Jacob, he got Rachel, but he also got 7 more years of labor. 14 years total, 14 years for one woman. And in the end, he ended up with 2 wives and all the drama and conflict that came with it. So what do we take away from this story? Yeah, it's dramatic. Yeah, it's got betrayal and deception and romance. But there's something deeper here. Something that speaks to us even today, thousands of years later. Jacob the deceiver got deceived. The man who'd lied to his father, who'd stolen from his brother, who'd built his life on tricks and schemes. He finally experienced what it felt like to be on the receiving end. And you know what? That's how life works sometimes. The Bible says, you reap what you sow. What goes around comes around. The universe has a way of teaching us lessons, sometimes the hard way. But here's the beautiful thing about this story. It didn't end with the deception. This was just the beginning of Jacob's journey. Over the next 14 years working for Laban, Jacob would learn patience. He'd learn humility. He'd learn what it meant to be faithful even when you've been wronged. He'd learn to be a better man than he was when he arrived. God used this painful experience to refine Jacob's character, to shape him into the man he needed to become. The man who would eventually become Israel, the father of the 12 tribes, and Leah, the unwanted wife. God saw her pain. He opened her womb, and she had children. While Rachel, the beloved wife, struggled with infertility for years, God had compassion on the one who was unloved. And Rachel eventually had children too. Joseph, who would save his entire family from famine. Benjamin, who would father one of the tribes of Israel. This messy, complicated family became the foundation of God's chosen people. So when you're lying there tonight, thinking about your own life, your own mistakes, your own times when you've been deceived or when you've deceived others, remember Jacob. Remember that God can take our messes and turn them into something beautiful. Remember that consequences are real, but they're not the end of the story. Remember that change is possible. That growth is possible. That redemption is possible. Even when you feel like you've messed up beyond repair, even when you feel like you're trapped in a situation you can't escape, even when 7 years turns into 14, and you wonder if it's ever going to get better, God is still working, still shaping, still redeeming. Jacob's story reminds us that we're all flawed. We all make mistakes. We all hurt people and get hurt by people. But those experiences can change us if we let them. They can make us bitter, or they can make us better. They can harden our hearts or soften them. The choice is ours. So as you drift off to sleep tonight, let this ancient story remind you that your past doesn't define your future, that your mistakes can become your greatest lessons, that even in the midst of deception and pain, God is weaving a bigger story, a story of redemption, a story of transformation, a story where broken people become the heroes, where the deceived become the faithful, where love wins even when it has to wait. Rest well, dream peacefully, and wake up tomorrow ready to write the next chapter of your own story.